With this series, we wanted to ask ourselves a number of questions. What is dissent? Which stories of dissent get told? Who is remembered and who is forgotten? Which bodies are always considered dissenting? And how can we draw upon the lives of dissenters in the past in the ways that we resist in the present? From the historical home of dissenters and abolitionists here in Newington Green, this series of talks aims to uncover histories of radicalism from the bottom up, finding inspiration from the past and hope in the present. For this session, we're discussing dissenting academies and radical education. Once again, our theme is intimately tied with histories of Newington Green and the meeting house itself. It's easy to see the legacies of the local dissenting academies of anti-monarchists or Mary Wollstonecraft's school only a few buildings away. It may be harder to find remnants of the multifarious radical practices of teaching and pedagogy happening behind closed doors, between families and communities over meals and drinks, responding to an education system that is at best inadequate and at worst actively hostile. Schools, colleges, and universities continue to function as places where the state attempts to control the ideology of its nation. Rather than spaces to liberate minds, schools, unfortunately, are being transformed into factories for weighing students, banning anti-capitalist thought, and not that it was present in the first place, and generally quashing any dreams of an otherwise that we might find in this place. But where we can find hope is in the ways people have always managed to find ways out from these oppressive spaces, whether it's in radical publishing, Black supplementary schools, teach outs, occupations, or organizing happening over the dinner table. People find ways to teach, learn, and resist together. And tonight, to speak about his experiences, we'll be hearing from Ken Walpole. Ken is a writer and social historian who between 1969 and 1973 worked as an English teacher at Hackney Downs School. Ken went on to work with the radical Hackney Bookshop Centerprise to encourage and publish work by young Black and working class students that could be used to enlarge the range and subject matter of literature and history that could be used in the classroom. Ken, it's lovely to have you here with us tonight.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Rory. And I assume everybody can hear me. I can hear myself now. Yes, I was pleased to be invited to join this because it did give a chance to kind of go back almost 50 years, well, it is 50 years, to a kind of time when I think the plates of kind of what the curriculum was, certainly in primary and secondary schools, really began to shift over issues of the representation of the increasingly diverse community that was now represented in British society. I trained to be a teacher between 1965 and 1969 as an English teacher. And the big thing then wasn't actually multiculturalism. It was this notion that too often the only role of children in school was to stay quiet and not to speak, not to have their voices heard. And this was literally true. And there was a whole kind of, an older generation, much older than me, obviously all now past, mostly women who'd kind of come up through Freudianism or through psychoanalysis, who were very keen to bring in notions of free expression or self-expression into the classroom. And this really began to create some very interesting tensions in schools. We were told, when I was trained to be a teacher, that unless you could actually encourage young people to talk about their own selves, their own lives, then they were never going to get validated within the education system. They would only ever be regarded as objects, but never as subjects of their own kind of identity. And this notion of self-expression became extremely important. And as teachers in the classroom began, to listen to the stories that children told, they realized that there was an enormous gap between the lives of the children that they were teaching, their home lives, their aspirations, their communities, their friendships, the things they hoped for or things they were scared of, and the world of kind of, particularly for us, and I was trained to be a junior secondary school teacher, the world of the reading book, which had a kind of privilege, a completely nuclear, middle-class nuclear family, completely uncontested, very little and fairly wealthy, full of opportunities, but bore no relationship to the majority of lives of the children in English schools. And so it was in the 60s as part of that much wider kind of radical impulse in the 60s, which eventually led in music to punk and all other kinds of things. But this notion that everybody has a story to tell and that education should be really based around people's experiences, or there should be some kind of dynamic between the teacher and the student in the sharing or a discourse of how each person's life was being lived and how they understand what they were teaching. So I came to Hackney in 1969 and went straight into Hackney Downs School, which was a boys' school. The pattern then under Elia was one boys' school, one girls' school, and one mixed school. So the majority of young people were taught in single-sex schools. And Hackney Downs had been a grammar school, but in 1969 it became a comprehensive school. And when I arrived, about 40% of the boys were Jewish. Very, very few of them Orthodox Jewish. In fact, hardly any of them were Orthodox Jewish, mostly secular Jewish students. But then we had a very large number of young Afro-Caribbean boys arriving into school. And this created a real issue for the teaching staff, because they'd never had any young students before like them with such different experiences of life. Many had only been brought over fairly recently. Their parents had arrived first. They'd been brought up by grandparents. There was lots of things, that they were shocked by arriving. They had to remake their family relationships and so on. And it was then that, radical English teachers saw that we should begin to start creating teaching materials that reflected the lives of the children. And of course, at this time, 1971, just down the road in Stepney, there was this famous kind of controversy when the teacher, Chris Searle, published a book of young people's poems called Stepney Words, and was actually sacked from teaching because he'd allowed young people to express their disillusionment with school, their anxieties about society, their fear of racism, the many things that they felt was wrong with society. And he was sacked as a result. But it is true that kind of you can look at certain periods when there are things going on simultaneously all around the country. It's not a case of there's always only one place where something emerges. There's always something kind of in the water, so to speak, that things are going on. And in London in the 60s, English teaching became very radicalised through an organisation called the London Association of the Teachers of English. They had conferences and meetings, and the focus for that was new teaching materials. So, an early thing I wrote, actually, probably in 1971, was for the magazine New Society, which was an essay called Ladybird Life, which looked at Ladybird books and the world, the reading of the books produced by Ladybird, and the world they were used in most primary schools, and the world they represented seemed light years away from anything that the children in the schools were actually experiencing themselves. So at Hackney Downs, then we began to kind of record some of the young people, or start publishing even their short stories and poems, as Chris Searle had done down the road at Stepney. And we were also beginning to get quite excited about new technologies, which now seem amazingly kind of archaic, but a duplicating machine, an instant camera, and a cassette tape recorder, we felt kind of liberated us to kind of remake the world. So one of the things we did was that there was a young boy in one of my classes called Vivian Usherwood, a young Afro-Caribbean boy, who was actually at that time in a care home. And I got to know him quite well, and he went to a teacher for supplementary English teaching. His reading and writing wasn't very good. But on the other hand, he began to write these extraordinary poems. And they were so extraordinary that this other teacher and I, we just kind of typed them out and just used them to teach other students in the school. And I've got one here. This is genuinely the original, right? Vivian did the cover. It's stuck together with 2 staples. And it's got all his poems in. And they worked a treat. I mean, the other children loved them. Other teachers wanted to borrow them. Then we kind of lent them to people in other schools. And the demand began to increase. So the next thing we did was produce one that actually had a price on the cover, 5p. And that's Vivian standing in the park outside Hackney Downs School. And we couldn't keep up with the demand. And exactly at this time, the librarian at Hackney Downs School was a woman called Margaret Gosley, and her partner was a Black American draft resister called Glenn Thompson. And Glenn Thompson, and this is where it's very interesting, this notion of the Radical Academy. Glenn Thompson had come to Europe, you know, to escape the draft. He didn't want to go to Vietnam. And he travelled around Europe, and he got very fascinated by a tradition in some of the Scandinavian countries of having a bookshop and a cafe together as a meeting place, but also where you might have discussion groups. And he thought this was really rather good, in the sense that too often education took place in rather austere surroundings. It was not connected to the street, had no kind of social support like a coffee machine or anything like that, and was kind of detached from kind of everyday life. So he'd come to Hackney with Margaret, and they wanted to set up a bookshop cafe, which they did in Dalston Lane, and that opened in literally 1971, May 1971. It was Dalston Lane. One of the buildings is still there. It was scheduled to be demolished in 2 years in 1971. It's still there, preserved or part of a conservation area. So Glenn set up this bookshop, and I knew Margaret because she was a school librarian. Margaret knew young Vivian as well. And so we talked with Glenn Thompson about, well, there's such a demand for this little pamphlet. Can we start thinking about publishing children's writing? And that's what we did. And in the next 5 years, that's the next iteration of Vivian's, that's 10p. And the final iteration is this one. In the next 10 years, something like 10,000 copies of Vivian's poems were printed and sold. And his poems appeared in 2 of the major initial great anthologies of Afro-Caribbean writing in Britain. One, Bluefoot Traveller by, I'll remember his name in a minute, but James Berry, a very prestigious black poet. So the only really tragic thing about this was that Vivian died at the age of 18 in a house fire. It wasn't the New Cross house fire, but in a flat of his own in Stoke Newington, actually only 100 yards from Unitarian Church. That was awful. But the kind of interest in this, the appetite to really open up schools or the teaching materials to these new voices was really very enormous. So a thing that I then did with another person I've been at Teacher Training College with was to do, in a way, the first reading book, possibly, in this country. This is the Hackney Half-Term Adventure. First reading book that had black children and white children playing together with kind of this sort of scenario that you don't normally find in children's reading books, this kind of setting for stories. I love this photograph because it's a bit like, there's the four boys there. They're kind of like in some Italian Nouveau Vague film. But this was going on, and this was going on all over the country. This kind of absolutely turning the world, turning the discourse and the material of the teaching of reading upside down by bringing new images and new representations into the school. Centerprise then decided that they would actually go into publishing full time as well as running the bookshop, and I was the first person to be appointed to do that. But I was just really the administrator. We had lots of different people running writers groups and workshops, and we had lots of teachers coming in, bringing students in for day classes and so on. Then I think the great thing about teaching was that you could actually take children out of the classroom and wander down the canal, or to go down Ridley Road Market occasionally, which would be absolutely forbidden now. The idea of letting children out of school during daytime and letting them actually see the world outside is, and I was very much influenced then by the anarchist Colin Ward, who I think in 1974 did a book called The Exploding School, which was absolutely recommending that the whole point of school is to, as a base for going out into the world and enabling young people, young children, to understand how society works by visiting places and talking to people. And that's what we did. We did also I got young people taking tape recorders home and talking to their parents, interviewing their parents about their lives, and they were bringing it back to school and we were discussing it in class. So it was this kind of opening up the school to the community. I'll just show two more things because they're lovely productions and they're nothing to do with me. They were both published by Centerprise. A lovely collection of short stories by a young Nigerian woman, Stella Ibekwe, called Teenage Encounters, a young woman. And then this was based on a young black writers group, Talking Blues, that was held at Centerprise for about 3 years running. And this proliferated. And this is why I'm sad that Gurminder couldn't join us tonight, because I would have been interested to see how he reacts to now, or how he as a different generation would look back and understand it. But the excitement about technology now seems kind of immature or naive, because all those things were rapidly taken over by offset printing, video, and now obviously digital. But I still think the notion, the pedagogical notion that education is a conversation between people and their experiences and the sharing of experiences is still central, which is why I've always preferred, doing talks in bookshops or youth clubs or churches or, or meeting or running workshops, writers' workshops, anywhere but in a school building or a university. Because I think, this notion of the radical academy has always had this strong dissenting tradition that it's outside the institutions of power. And it's a kind of, these are spaces that we create ourselves where we can genuinely talk to each other. So that was that experience. And there is a book, which a history of the early days of Centerprise, and it's called The Lime Green Mystery, because the bookshop did last for nearly 40 years, although it was only for 3 years at Dorset Lane, and then it went to Kingston High Street. But all kinds of I stayed up for 5 years and then left to do other things. I also thought that one should leave after a certain amount of time. I'm not really in favour of people hanging on in there for too long. stultifying and getting on everybody else's nerves. And I've given Amy and Rory a link so you can actually read this book online. The whole book is online, and it is the story of those workshops, the adult literacy projects, the girls projects, you know, the black writers groups. It's got all those in it, and it tells the story of how this bookshop did genuinely become a kind of dissenting radical academy. Now, I'm happy to answer any questions about that or share thoughts and ideas. But that's, as I say, I'm sorry that Kenda couldn't be with us because it's a bit one-sided. But there we are. Over back to you, Rory and Amy.
Thanks so much, Ken. That was really, really fascinating. I've kind of, it sent my mind off in so many different directions. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat, or you're also welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question directly. So I'll just give people space to do that now, just in case anyone does have a question.
I had no idea that you were Vivian Isherwood's teacher, Ken. That's fantastic, because I read all of those poems and couldn't believe that. I mean, because, you know, there's really awful experiences that you'd hope that lots of children wouldn't have to go through. And also, you know, he's swearing and that kind of thing. And, you know, it's so silly, isn't it? But then to see like children's poetry where they're swearing and they're being encouraged to express themselves, even I was like, oh, wow, you know, and it shouldn't be like that. But I remember feeling like that and thinking, wow, I can't believe that someone actually worked on this. So that's amazing that you were part of that.
Yeah. And I think about 4 years, around the time that book was launched, that's probably about 4 years ago, there was an event at the Hackney Museum, and two young black actors read the poems, Vivian's poems, and Vivian's sister was there, and we all kind of had a good cry. But it was a wonderful, wonderful event. And but it was more Vivian's, because of course then they called her, she was the remedial teacher. Now what language is that, you know? But I was his form teacher, and Anne Pettit was his remedial teacher, and together we kind of published the poems. But since then one is always astonished by just how fantastic writing there is out there. You've just got to let the voices come through. Interestingly, not everybody at the school then approved of this. You know, as you say, Amy, a poem that had a swear word in. Actually, they weren't bad. I mean, it was just he was fed up with being knocked about in his care home, and or being bullied, or people not taking him seriously, or people not listening to him. And, you know, this is hard stuff, and it's painful stuff, but it's an antidote to that world of kind of happy, smiling children in beautiful gardens, where nothing ever goes wrong. And when we try and compare our lives to those lives, as we all do when we grow up, I mean, the world is always better in the books than we seem to think it is for ourselves. But obviously we learn otherwise. It was a very important lesson.
I kind of actually just had a follow-up question to that, because it seems like what you were able to do and what everyone at Enterprise was able to do is stick to a quite maybe like profound and not very common idea in education now, which is that like children are actual human beings who have thoughts and lives and dreams and pain. And I guess I wanted to ask if you had particular pushback from either staff or parents in relation to the ways you were interacting with students or treating students.
There was a little bit. There was a little bit. I do remember that one parent did come up to the school, and it was okay. But she because I'd asked the class as one of the exercises to interview one of their grandparents, and the one parent came up and said, "I don't want him talking to his grandfather, or I don't want, you know, I don't want him to know what his grandfather did," and so on. I mean, and that's completely understandable. Obviously, there have to be, you know, everybody's got the right not to tell their lives as much as they have the right to tell their lives. But I think, no, I mean, what is interesting is that some of the other teachers couldn't believe that the children wrote this stuff. They thought, well, surely you did it. I mean, you didn't. Vivian didn't write that, did he? You know, well, he did. You know, but then there's a problem that what do you do with it? Because in the school, you couldn't do anything with it. I mean, I gave up teaching literally because I couldn't stand marking anymore. And because I knew at the end, you know, at the end of the year, everything goes in the dustbin. All the exercise books and the exam, the things they wrote for the exams, and the artwork they did, you know, for their, you know, it's just going on the bonfire somewhere. And this notion that it's all rehearsal, that, you know, all the things you do at school are simply rehearsing, or they're practicing, as though nothing actually is ever achieved. And all the time in education, people are achieving things and doing things that actually come out sometimes fully formed and should be preserved. But the idea that you're just only ever practicing in education, you're only ever kind of, you know, training, or whatever, some ghastly word like that is. It's though it's not real. But education, what happens in education is real life, and it often is the end thing. It's the end product. It is the great experience. Is that relationship? What goes on in that discussion? And anybody who's taught evening classes knows this. You know, the most amazing things happen in evening classes. I love adult education, and I think one of the things we might take out of this whole series is really to recommit ourselves to continuing education, because for me it's fantastic. You know, really very second chance education, lifetime learning. You know, changing your life at 40 and trying something completely new. All these renewed opportunities. I think that's what education is about. It's not through that kind of, you get one go and it's only training anyway. It's not for me. Yeah.
Do you feel that there's less opportunities to do that now? I mean, as someone who, oh, Katie says she agrees on the chat. I think that, you know, I tend to look maybe, or maybe some people say sometimes I look back at those kind of, that period with rose-tinted glasses, and I didn't live through that. And, you know, these periods of that, either GLC giving lots of money to things and that kind of thing. And I'm aware that, you know, I maybe only see one kind of view of that. But it seems to me that those opportunities, those adult education courses, classes, environments, community printing projects are much, much less than they were before. Ken, do you agree, or do you think that the internet has kind of picked up on that?
I have to say I don't really know. I mean, obviously we've been badly damaged by COVID that stops a lot of these things to happen. And I'm also shocked, really, by, I can't believe, I mean, I do think adult education does need some public finance because it's so important to many people, gives them this second chance. I mean, we used to run writers' workshops, kind of, you know, 50p a pound a session for the coffee and the biscuits. But I now see coming so many things like, you know, six course session with a write of £150, and I just think, no, you know, that's not, it's not right. there has to be another kind of adult education or continuing education needs a different economic model than self-financing. Because in the end, I mean, it's really part of how people are able to renew themselves continuously through life, and not just take the verdict of what was given to them at the end of when they left school or when they finally left universities. That was the end. That was the final verdict on their development, their intellectual development or educational development. So no, continuing education, I think, really does need a new economy.
Can you talk a little bit about so your comments about how education is conceived, the extent to which they apply today versus when you were teaching, or areas where you've seen progress or lack of progress?
It's a very difficult question. The fact is that the zeitgeist in the 60s and early 70s was more or less accepted by certainly most English teachers. This notion that you can't keep children silent anymore, and that their experiences have to come in to the classroom and be part of their education. And I mean, a lot of this work was done, as I say, by a lot of older women teachers who'd come up through the psychoanalytic tradition, but who had kind of running schools as headmasters, very progressive head teachers of primary schools, primary education. And then, I mean, Freudianism was big, and so this notion of self-expression, letting it come out, was actually widely accepted in the 60s and 70s, much more than it is now, where we're, just everything now, education is about constraining. It's back to training and the national curriculum and jumping through hoops. So I think it was easier then. And I don't know, in fact, because in a way it was more exciting because it was new, we were doing this, but now luckily and happily we do have a much wider range of materials to use in the class. And, the novels, the fiction, the poetry, the music coming out and being shared in schools at least is a lot more diverse than it was, absolutely. So a lot of, I mean, these are genuine achievements, I think, and they're things that we should defend. And they're very, I mean, they are just genuinely very vibrant now, I think, in the culture, the notion of diversity in creativity and all voices being heard and all representations being given significant space in the culture. This is all, I think, much more accepted. I hope so.
I really appreciate just hearing your passion for education. As generally, it really reminds me of my parents, actually, because I was raised by both my parents are primary school teachers, but also I have two mums. They're lesbian, and they have talked a lot about, I guess, being teachers during Section 28 being a thing, and I think it's left a real kind of stain on a lot of educational practices in this country generally, and not just specifically that Section 28 itself, in terms of restricting materials about gay people and queer people, but that, I guess, the idea that the government can restrict materials generally about what is taught in schools, and I see a lot of, I'm worried because I see a lot of that attitude kind of having a bit of a resurgence at the moment.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you it's not the best question. I don't know if you have any thoughts on maybe where education is currently headed in this country, and if you maybe see ways out in, you know, supplementary education or these educational spaces found outside of schools themselves.
No, I think you're right, Rory. I mean, you know, the notion of the museums, you know, the minister can tell museums what they can or cannot exhibit. I mean, it's atrocious. I mean, there's, so I think, yeah, there is obviously now pressure downwards really to try and restrict the cultural agenda, or the range, the cultural range, the broad, you know, the bandwidth of what is acceptable. Which is why I suppose I've always thrown my lot in with the alternative scene, and preferring to work outside in institutions, because I think, you know, that will always in some ways influence the mainstream. The mainstream can't resist actually or every idea that comes out of other ways. So I think there, you know, there's so much more I think needs to be. I think on the whole, primary schools in Britain have been pretty good places. I think there's a general feeling that it's been a much more homely, friendly, you know, experience. Secondary schools, I think, are pretty dreadful. But I think in primary schools were, for, you know, have always, you know, have been much more, certainly much more influenced by psychology and child development studies and Winnicott and all that stuff. I mean, really, whereas that, I mean, talk to anybody at Hackney Downs when I arrived there. So all the all-male staff about Winnicott or Freud, or they wouldn't know who you're talking about. It sounds rather cruel, but there wasn't that kind of notion that you know, people have these kind of life, you know, these mentalities and these kind of richnesses inside them.
I just wanted to, because we're on the topic of kind of like publishing and people's experiences and stories, Caroline, I don't know if you wanted to say a couple of words about the zine that you're working with us on about community writing.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm Caroline. Thanks so much for your presentation, Ken, and to Amy and Rory for hosting. I found it so interesting and inspiring. Yeah, I'm a volunteer at the Meeting House, and I've been working with Amy and Nick on this new publishing project, which we've called Enzine, after the postcode preface. And yeah, Amy's just put some information in the chat, but basically, I mean, your talk got me kind of thinking about possible ways that we might try and engage sort of younger people as well, and try to make it a sort of home for as many different kinds of aspiring writers as possible. And it's sort of, yeah, one of the main inspirations for the project was Centerprise and the idea of a Hackney autobiography, which we found kind of really, yeah, like a really good sort of springboard for continuing that idea of a kind of living autobiography of the local area. So yeah, there's some, basically we're hoping it will be a quarterly publication, and we've at the moment sort of been setting out loose themes for each issue. So the first theme is local spaces and places, and so yeah, and in the lead up to each issue, we'll have kind of workshops and things at the Meeting House where we can look at texts like, for example, poems by Vivian Usherwood and other sort of case studies of community publishing. I know Amy's worked on a similar project that was based in Peckham. And yeah, I mean, just to make it kind of like an open space where people can talk about what they'd like to get out of the zine and what they'd like to kind of, what might be possible ways to use the workshop space as well. So yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm sure that maybe we could talk more about this another time, but and make some connections with kind of the work that you did through Centerprise as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Caroline. I kind of threw you in at the deep end there, but I thought it would be a good opportunity to mention. So I put a link in the chat. If anyone wants to contribute to Enzine, you might have some existing writing, or you might just be interested in doing some writing. And then come along. You can contribute. There's an email you can send your work to. If you want us to Caroline's a poet in her own right. If you want Caroline to support you with your writing, then she can, or Nick can. And if not, we will just publish it without any edits or suggestions. You know, it's your own work. Otherwise, and also we have an event on the 29th of July. It's in the link, and that will just be people that are interested or may be interested in contributing can come along, and we can have a drink and have a chat, and you can see if it's for you. So hopefully we can carry on some of this work in the tradition that Ken's been talking to us about today.
Does anybody have any final questions or comments? I feel like this is probably a good time to draw things to a close, unless anyone has anything to add. So do put anything in the chat or come out just in case there is anything you want to say.
Okay, well, nice to meet everybody, and yeah, I'm sure we'll bump into each other fairly soon.
Thanks so much, Ken.
We've got some version of the Literature Festival, I think, coming up in September, so I'm sure we'll all be bumping into each other then. Yeah. Okay, well, bye for now then.
Thank you so much, Ken.
Bye.
Really appreciated you speaking.
Bye.
Thank you.